Hello, how are you all? I'm Lucas Kanga, and today we're going to have a chat in our module on basic principles. Let's start by saying that humanity prefers, wants, or feels that it makes rational decisions. In reality, that's not the case, and almost 20% or even fewer decisions are made rationally. Why does this happen? Because, in fact, the brain tries to use automatic processes. So we make decisions even before we think about evaluating them. We already know what we prefer, what we want, what we'd rather avoid, or what we want to move towards. This way of acting is called automatic, and underlying it is a basic concept known as Hebb's law. Hebb's law refers then to the brain's ability each time to strengthen the connections that we normally stimulate and weaken, the ones we don't use. Obviously, we need to have automatic behaviours. What's the law? So we don't have to think about the activities or actions we need to do naturally, like how we wake up, how we go to the office, when we have to turn on our computer, for example, or enter our password. And all of that is done automatically. But where does that come from? In the neurons that are indeed part of Hebb's law. The Hebbian network means that we have much stronger connections than others. Imagine, for example, having to travel to a distant destination on a 6-lane road versus a single-lane road. It would be quicker, faster, more efficient. Every time we have to do something automatically, the brain will do it. So the brain is lazy. Why do we say it's lazy? We say our brain is lazy because every time we have to learn something new, it has to use up new resources. And of course, it has to take those resources from the body's general metabolism. And the body as well. It wants to rely on that metabolism. That's why learning something new will always tire us out, sometimes frustrate us or make us feel unmotivated. It's a biological signal for us to maintain the status quo. Let's move on to a second basic principle, which is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to create new connections. What for? To learn, to change our connectome, as we've already discussed. So we have two types of neuroplasticity. The first is intrinsic plasticity, which is simply connecting neurons to other neurons through structures called dendrites, which we'll look at later. But we can also achieve neuroplasticity by creating new neurons, and that's called neurogenesis. Genesis means to create. Neuro refers to neurons, so neurogenesis is the creation of new neurons. This was discovered many years ago. It was discovered when researchers studied taxi drivers in London who have to pass a very complex exam and are required to memorise all the streets of London, which, believe me, are quite intricate, and it's rather complicated to get from one place to another. They had to remember absolutely everything by heart and recall every single detail. They studied an area in the taxi drivers called the hippocampus, and they realised that the number of neurons in the taxi driver's hippocampus increased. We were faced with understanding neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons. And we'll finish with a third basic principle called orientation by zones versus systems. A long time ago, in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was thought that there were areas of the brain that were closely linked to each of the functions. And there was a movement, which we now almost look at with amusement, led by Joseph Gull, who believed that in each area of the brain, an action resided. They were called the localizationists. If you look at literature from that time, you'll see that he collected skulls, collected the shapes of people's brains to measure them externally. In other words, from the outside, he measured bumps and protrusions and claimed he could predict what kind of psyche that person had. What we now look at with surprise and almost amusement actually led to new knowledge, which has to do with the fact that in reality the brain is entirely connected, and instead of areas we have systems. It's the way our brain protects itself against certain losses, accidents, or some kind of pathology. If we have a problem in one hemisphere, then a system can take over the function somewhere else. If you notice, on the one hand the brain protects itself, but on the other it also tries to use less energy. And above all else, it tries to have a connectome that can anticipate and be sustained over time. So to review a bit of what we covered in today's module, we talked about some basic principles. The first basic principle is Hebb's law. and that ability the brain has to strengthen the connections it uses regularly and weaken those it doesn't use. Given that, we said that our brain is lazy because it wants to use less and less energy. And to be able to make sure that the 20% of energy it gets can be used for the tasks it uses most often. So we're not always rational. Instead, we generally make decisions on autopilot. The last concept we looked at was understanding what neuroplasticity is. Plasticity is essentially the brain's remarkable and inherent ability to dynamically connect with other crucial areas when it genuinely needs to learn or develop some kind of entirely new skill or understanding, allowing for continuous adaptation and growth. Skill. Without forgetting the concept of zone versus system, what makes us human is that we don't have certain actions linked to specific areas. Instead, the brain is completely interconnected as a system. Thank you for taking part in this module, and I'll see you in future sessions. Thank you very much.